Hello and welcome to Magala Foresight. This is Mikhail Menace, producer and host of the show. With me today again is Professor Miriam van Riesen, Professor of International Relations, Innovation and Care at Tilburg University and University of Leiden. Professor Miriam, welcome to Magala Foresight.
Thank you.
This is, I think, the second time in a few weeks that we are meeting. So I'm very grateful to you. I'm honored to have you on my show. Also because very recently you and your fellow researchers published a book, a very important book, Enslaved, Trapped and Trafficked in Digital Black Holes, Human Trafficking Trajectories to Libya. That's the title, edited by Miriam van Riesen, Munir Radzi Mawere, Clara Smith, and Margan Wirtz. It's a voluminous 821-page book divided in 17 chapters. This book is largely based on the work of the research team, Social Dynamics of Digital Innovation in Remote Non-Western Communities, SDDI, of Tilburg University. The fieldwork was undertaken between 2019 and 2021. So let's start from the topic. It appears that this barbaric, seemingly old-fashioned trajectory is associated with digital technology, this modern technology. How?
Yes, that is correct. It is really since the mobile phone became available globally that we have seen that this kind of human trafficking for ransom through the mobile phone has been enabled. So the technology really enables this new form of human trafficking, which takes people, abducts people, kidnaps people to places from which they cannot escape, and places which are isolated, which are not possible for international organizations or other organizations that could otherwise give protection to visit, and held in isolation in those trafficking camps. These refugees and migrants are then forced by the traffickers to phone by mobile phone to their relatives to beg for money. And in order to make that more efficient, if you would use that word, the begging, it can really go into thousands of US dollars, what is being asked for ransom. Then to make relatives do this, the migrants and refugees who are held in these trafficking camps, they are often very badly tortured, beaten, and also assaulted with sexual violence and rape. So it is very, very sadistic, cruel practices that we see in this new form of human trafficking for ransom.
Yeah, very tragic indeed. So this book, I understand, is part of a series, this being the latest of 5 books on connected issues of migration and human trafficking in Africa. What piqued your and your fellow researchers' interest in this issue?
The initial interest in this issue started in 2009. We had a conference in Brussels, and the conference was about the European and United States policy towards Eritrea. And at that meeting, there was Father Musi Zarai from Eritrea. He attended that conference, and he was very often approached by refugees who were trying to flee. And he spoke for the very first time, to my knowledge, about refugees that were held in isolated buildings in Sinai. And that is where our research started to understand better what was going on. We had never heard of something like this. And so that is where we found for the first time that especially refugees from Eritrea, 95% of the people were from Eritrea, that they were abducted from Sudan, also from Ethiopia, the Tigray region, also where the camps are of Eritrean refugees, and where they were then transported to Sinai, and then they were tortured in Sinai, where they were forced to beg relatives who would then transfer the money also by new technology at the time, where you could then make these transfers to bank accounts, often in the country where these relatives were. That could be in Eritrea, but in Eritrea it could be handing over the money in cash. But for instance, if it would be a relative in the Netherlands, there would be an Eritrean agent in the Netherlands, and they would transfer to that agent, and that agent would transfer it onwards. And we published 2 books at the time, and then we did again interviews after this practice in the Sinai had been stopped by the Egyptian government in 2014. And we then continued to try and understand what happened after the human trafficking in that particular location had ended. And then in the following book in 2017, we wrote how this form of human trafficking had become very lucrative and now had expanded to Sudan and then especially to Libya. And so we published that in books in 2017, 2019. And now the latest book that we have published really focuses on the trajectory from Eritrea to Libya, and then what happens in Libya.
Although slavery was abolished in 1865, we know that slavery has continued to this day, according to the latest global estimates of modern slavery, 2022, that was published by Work Free, the ILO, and the IOM. 49.6 million people live in modern slavery. Roughly a quarter of them are children. The range of the situation the victims are in is diverse, from forced labor to forced marriage. So diverse that one victim interviewed in this book and quoted in the preface by President of the Pan-African Parliament, Fortune Charumbira, the victim asks, "It is like slavery, or is it slavery?" What do you say to that?
Yes, it is certainly slavery, because people are held. They are not free to go from that location. They are held under very inhumane circumstances, and they are held for profit. They also have a particular code. You know, in the past slavery, it would be that you were the property by a title deed. In the modern day slavery in Libya, you belong to a human trafficker, a chief, people say, and you have a code, you have a digital code. So it's a modern way of belonging to these criminal trafficking networks. And they profit from the forcing the victims to beg for money, and they extort in that way huge amounts of money. The people that are held in these slavery conditions, they are sold like any other good from one place to another place. They may be having their relatives pay for their release, but then they might be sold on to another human trafficking group and another one. Sometimes they come into the detention centers of the Libyan government, but then again, they might be sold back to the human trafficking criminal groups. So the whole situation is one that denies these victims any humanity, and their life is just prolonged as long as they can make profit from it. And the alternative is that they either lose their life, they disappear, or that they are forced to work in the human trafficking networks, either to torture others, to recruit, to as agents, etc. So it is very much similar to the slavery as we know it from the past. However, it is using modern techniques.
And gruesome techniques. Yeah. So as described in the book, these people, these victims, do not have the right to have rights, and that this situation is being exacerbated, you say in the preface, by policies of the EU, that this human trafficking cycle of being trapped and trafficked and everything in between.
That is correct. First of all, we need to understand who the main perpetrators are. So the main perpetrators on the trajectory from Eritrea to Libya are human traffickers that are Eritreans and that are harbored and supported and connected to the Eritrean regime. That is the first conclusion that we drew, and of course that is still needs to be proved in court. You know that on the 1st of January, one of them, Kidane, was arrested, and he should be extradited to the Netherlands. There's also Walid Goitom, who is already in the Netherlands. He was tried, both he and Kidane were tried in Ethiopia and found guilty of this. Both of them are Eritrean traffickers, and they are not the only ones. There are others as well in this network. The European Union also has responsibility in the sense that on this trajectory, there is one escape, and that is from Tripoli to the European Union. But the European Union is funding, or at least this seems to be the case, funding the Libyan court guards and also the Libya detention centers. And it would appear to us from the material that we have that these coast guards and these detention centers, which are often run by militia, are also collaborating with the human traffickers. So it's a different degree in the sense that the European Union is not a perpetrator. I think that what really needs to be investigated, first of all, is the perpetrators and how is it possible that Eritrean asylum seekers are trafficked by Eritrean traffickers. But in addition to that, it is important that we understand any further responsibility to aggravate the situation. And it seems that the European Union has questions to answer in that regard.
In fact, so many questions to answer, because not only those who have fled their countries and made it to Libya, but even those who are blocked from coming out of their countries, in the face of tragedy like the genocide in Tigray. The Ethiopian Prime Minister successfully sealed Tigray, and he seems to have convinced the Europeans that if he lets influx of refugees to inundate Sudan, then they will be going to the same route that the others took and find themselves, flood Europe. And it seems, and many accuse the European Union for looking away on this, although it has spoken on many other aspects of the conflict. But in Western Tigray, this policy of besieging Tigray and starving them to death, which is crime against humanity, has been, it seems, the European Union has been complacent in this as well. So we need to call a spade a spade. If the European Union is collaborating with the coast guards, who are also collaborating with the traffickers, I think it is very clear to see the link.
In one of the previous books, the book that was published in 2020, we have published a chapter that looks at the European Union support to block the border to Sudan from Tigray. This is before the Tigray war. And then already it seemed that the European Union had found a way of supporting the rapid support forces, the RSF, from Sudan to carry out this blocking of the border. And you are very right to point out that this was further used in the Tigray war by the Ethiopian government. I think that the mistake is, and this is what we are also pointing out in the book, is that the European Union seems to depart from the thinking that if you block refugees, that then you decrease that mobility and you solve the problem. And there are at least two things that are completely wrong with that. One is that there is an obligation for those that are fleeing crimes against humanity, which is the case in Eritrea, where there is a permanent condition of national service, forced labor, which also could be qualified as modern slavery, and in Tigray, where people were subject to a war, a genocide-like war, maybe genocidal war. And so those fleeing from these situations, they need to be supported, they need to be given protection. So that is the first thing that is absolutely wrong. And the second thing that is wrong is that in any case, it doesn't work. And what happens is that the human trafficking criminal organizations benefit from these blockades. And what we researched in this book in Libya was the situation during COVID, when the borders in Libya were also closed. But in fact, you can see that it led to an increase in mobility, but also increase of the revenue for the human trafficking organizations. And similarly, in Tigray now, we can see that there is an uptake of the human trafficking networks. And we have already started to see routes that are now expanding from Ethiopia towards South Sudan, Kenya, and Uganda. And that should really be worrying for all of us, because this is no longer like it was in the Sinai. In the Sinai, it was already terrible, but it was a limited location. But here we're speaking now the whole of North Africa and is moving south. And with the danger that you transform economies into criminal economies. And that is really what has happened in Libya. And if it can happen in Libya, that can happen elsewhere. So I think your concern, as you raised it, is very well taken, and it is something that I hope we have addressed well in the book.
Yeah, you talked of the revenue. In the book, you mentioned 1 billion USD and still expanding. Where is this revenue going? Who are the beneficiaries?
The beneficiaries, in the way I now understand it, and again, all of this needs to be investigated further and should also be proved in court. I'm not a judge, I'm here as a researcher, as an investigator, but our understanding is that these revenues come together in the Red Sea Trading Corporation and the financial networks of the PFDJ, of HECDEF, and that the sources, the revenue sources are transferred to Dubai. In any case, the arrest of Kidane in Khartoum has led to his extradition to the Emirates, where he will be tried for whitewashing. So that seems to tally with what our findings would suggest. And then he will be extradited to the Netherlands in order to answer to the crimes against humanity committed in Libya. Earlier, he has already been sentenced with a lifelong sentence in Addis Ababa.
So the president of the African Parliament, who wrote the preface to the book, said that the enslavement of African people must stop, and that he will never sleep unless this is addressed. But in terms of, given the enormity of the problem and the suffering that Africans are going through, don't you think that Africa and African institutions like the AU, the African Parliament, Pan-African Parliament, have failed?
I think that the recognition of the importance of this has only come slowly. And it is difficult to know something about this situation, because what the criminal networks do is that they seal it off. The genocide in Tigray was under a blockade and was sealed off. There were no journalists, nobody knew what was going on. The abduction of the Eritrean refugees in Tigray, nobody has seen any images of that. In Libya, it is the same situation. It is in one of the places where the worst things happen in terms of the torture and the sadistic treatment of these victims of human trafficking. We have no images of it. So it is difficult to take political action if it is very difficult to investigate this. And that is why we are happy.
Professor, yes. But despite the attempt by the authoritarian regimes of Africa, to block information, like what happened in Tigray, commit genocide in the darkness, information was coming out, however little, and the world knows. We can't say the world does not know what happened in Tigray, and we can't say that the world does not know what has been happening in Libya. Even before CNN, reported this open auctioning inside the, camps in Libya, these enslavement camps, human trafficking camps in the deserts. The victims have been voicing their pleas.
I mean, yes, I do agree with you. But yesterday I was in class and I was speaking to my students here, my European students. They think everything is visible on the internet. They can see everything. We were talking about the situation in Libya, and they had never heard of it. So I don't want to make accusations to African parliaments or whatever, if on our side here we also have difficulty in educating the public about it, but I do agree with you that it is very important that governments support open systems, that they don't close the internet as a way of making sure that this information cannot come out. I absolutely agree with you. And I also think that if the internet or phone lines or whatever are used to facilitate this extortion, the companies that support these systems also bear a responsibility. So I think that these are hard questions that need to be considered by all of those that are involved.
In your book, you point out that the victims of slavery in Libya are not actually acknowledged as slaves, despite the fact that, and you have proven that it is the extreme form of slavery. They are not allowed to communicate their situation in person to representatives of the humanitarian organizations or to use the internet to bring attention to their plight. So why do you think this is happening? Why is this acknowledgement lacking?
As soon as they become dependent in the human trafficking trajectory, their phones are taken away. So the free communication is the first thing that is taken away. And that is why we are saying that these things are happening in black holes, in a space where all communication is shut off. And the reason that that is happening is exactly so that it doesn't become known and therefore it can continue to happen. So the access to communication is very unequal, and we do not always, and maybe people in Tigray are very sensitive to it because they have experienced it. But in Europe, many people, they do not, in fact, reflect on the situation that not everybody can freely communicate.
And now the physical and psychological impact of this slavery, this enslavement, the torture that these people have gone through. How do you describe it? What would be the short-term and long-term impact of it, and the way the mechanisms in place to address them?
It is so horrific. I was watching some of them again today, and it's really very, very disturbing. It's people are tortured by dripping hot plastic on their naked body. They are beaten, electrocuted. There's a lot of sexual violence. There is the story of the football match where people who miss a goal are shot, and the winning team is forced to rape the women in the hall where everybody is held. It's a very sadistic situation. The traumatic effects are, I think, there for life for anyone who has been in the situation. In Beni Walid, that is this place where many are held before they are then transported further. People are held in halls with many of them being dead, and so they are tied with the corpses. There's no food, no good food, no food at all. There are no facilities for hygiene, etc. The circumstances are very dire, and people can be there for years. So this is such a serious situation that it really affects everybody that is engaging with that situation. I was speaking yesterday to somebody who's such a brave man, And he has his nephew held in Tripoli now for years. And well, he just broke down as he was speaking to me on the phone. And he loves his work, but he's now on sick leave because he just can no longer cope with the situation. And then again, I was speaking to somebody else, and the sister was abducted actually from the hospital. She was wounded on the travel to Libya and held in a coma, or she was in a coma and held in the hospital. And even under that condition, the family members are being extorted and forced to pay. It is just unspeakable, and therefore the trauma and the secondary trauma and the trauma on the whole community, everybody in the family is so affected by it. And I would say that in the Eritrean context, that there isn't any family that isn't directly affected by what has happened. And what we should really avoid is to make sure that this would expand away from Eritrea into Tigray or Ethiopia. It's really so important that that does not happen.
As it is, although the focus seems to be on Eritrea, there are many others affected as well, Africans, Ethiopians including, right?
Yes, there are. Although in Libya, I would say that over half of the people held in these human trafficking conditions, as I described them, are Eritreans. But that still means that there is a good number of people from Somalia, from Ethiopia, from Sudan, South Sudan, Nigeria, and also West Africa. That's correct.
And what number are we talking about? In the book, I think I read something like 200,000, is it?
Yes, it's a very conservative estimate, just as $1 billion as the revenue in the last 5 years is also very conservative. But it's very difficult to get, I mean, those locations are impossible to visit. So the way in which we concluded on the figures is what we absolutely are sure of, but it might be much higher. It might just be the top of the iceberg, what we are able to report on.
Your attempt through this book is tremendous, in revealing the truth, in highlighting the problem. But the attempt to keep, potential refugees at bay, isn't it at the core of this problem, and why is the at least the human rights organizations, humanitarian organizations, not as vocal as should be the case, given the enormity of the problem?
Africa is a continent where people roam. I mean, the borders that we are talking about here, Sudan, Libya, they are just borders drawn with a ruler drawn up in Berlin. So this goes back to the colonial time. And for the European Union to now enforce these borders, not as living borders, but as borders from where mobility can be controlled, I think is a problem. And the African culture, the African way of living, living resiliently in the places as they are, they require that people can migrate, that people can move with their cattle, that people can go to places where there is temporary work, etc. So I do think that it is important that the African Union, that Africans ask that their culture and their way of living is respected. And I think that this way of enforcing a European thinking on borders is definitely part of the problem. And it is ironic because the European Union has become a world power because it abolished the borders. I can travel freely between the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany and so on. So in fact, it is contradictory to the European policy. So to have open borders on the African continent is a very important part of the fight against human trafficking. It is where you close the border that the human trafficking networks can find ways of making their money.
Thank you very much, Professor Miriam van Riesen, for these great reflections, for helping us make sense of the the findings of the research, that this enormous and very important research that you managed to publish. So thank you very much, and congratulations on this important work.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.